I'd like to begin by, oh, wrong screen. No, that's right screen. I'd like to begin by just giving you an overview of some of the essential elements we speak about in terms of leading teams. Now, I would imagine that many of you, after leaving VTS, will find yourselves in a ministry. For the most part, most of you will find yourself in a congregation. But there are, of course, other ministries around the church beyond just the congregational ministry. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes tonight to talk to you a little bit about vital teams as vestries. And then I'd like to spend some time to go into give you an overview of what we believe are three of the essential ingredients for developing strong teams. And these teams, these ingredients are appropriate for vestries, for executive boards, for community teams. So I'm going to try to round the presentation where we can focus on those three aspects. And then perhaps we can talk about some next steps, and I'd like to share with you some additional resources. Vestries as vital teams. In the overview here, I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of the vestry, perhaps some of the key responsibilities, and also share with you some of the tools and resources that you might find helpful for vestries and as working as leaders. We believe at ECF there are four primary role of a vestry: ongoing discernment and formation, mission and vision, selecting new leaders and helping foster new leaders into ministry, and stewardship of resources, which is probably the most common. First, let's talk a little bit about ongoing discernment. We believe that this is an ongoing process and really a question that we have to continually ask ourselves: where's God calling us? Where's God calling us as a congregation at this particular time in our location? Where do we see God leading us? And then when we come to understand some of these particular aspects, we want to begin to consider what our mission and vision is. And that will help us to understand how we will foster organization, how we will develop our teams as we move forward towards the mission and vision that we articulate. One of the major roles of any vestry or any church in general is to identify and promote and select new leaders, not just for at the congregational level, but also for service in the wider church. And probably the area that most of you are familiar with, the vestries work with and are challenged with and discern all the time, is how to manage parish resources and finances of the congregation. Before I get into some more details, I'd like to talk a little bit about one of the things we advocate for is establishing norms. In any group setting, we believe it's important to start by trying to establish team norms. This is a list, if you will, or an area where, as a group, we determine how we will function as a group and how we will operate as a group, and what might be some of the rules and principles around us functioning together as a group. What are some of the benefits of group norms? I think is that it puts all of us, the chair, the vestry, or the group that you're participating with, at a place where we all understand what our responsibilities are, what our accountabilities are, and how we will operate and function together as a team. Typically, I would ask at this point, what are some norms that would be typical of a vestry? And here I would like to suggest perhaps just a few for you. And I would imagine that many of you have perhaps participated on vestries at some time in your past life before coming to seminary. But one of the things that we talk about as a suggestion may be beginning meetings with a spiritual focus or a spiritual practice. Much like I started our time together tonight with a prayer. Of course, that could be Bible study perhaps, maybe a poem, something to get the group grounded and centered in the spirit before moving on to conduct the business of the vestry. How about another one? And I know this is pretty popular as we teach around the country, this curriculum. How about limiting the time of vestry meetings to a time certain, maybe 90 minutes, and certainly no more than 2 hours. We often find that one of the reasons that it's hard to attract individuals to the vestry is the length of time the vestries meet. How about working on I statements and asking the folks around the table to take ownership of their ideals and opinions? Oftentimes you'll hear in some meetings, I heard, or someone suggested, but really getting people to take the opportunity to really take ownership for their own ideals and their opinions. The other thing that I often say as a norm is to ask people to show up on time and end on time. These are just a few that we would suggest, and you'll encounter these, or perhaps have encountered some of these opportunities in vestry meetings or other meetings that you have attended. But we just really strongly advocate that at the very beginning of when you're bringing a team together is to sit down and develop a group of norms, rules, and ideals around accountability and how the team will function together. This is the chart I just want to talk about briefly when I talk about teams, and this is important to many of you as you will be soon going out into the wider church. Is remember your church size, or to have a good understanding of your individual context. What we've found over the years is that many places, and it's always in a good intention, we try to be all things to all people, but really size matters. And while we all would like to function as a program church, I think it's appropriate for us to really find our niche and whether we're family size, pastoral size, and design our ministry and our programs, and certainly our leadership and how we move forward with our teams around the size of our church. Create holy time away from the vestry. Again, this is a good opportunity, particularly when vestries are first beginning to form in the very beginning, to try to find some time where the vestry can focus. Perhaps this is maybe a 24-hour period where we really begin to focus on what the opportunities are for the vestry. How will we name our values? How will we talk about conflict and deal with conflict in the vestry? But vestry orientation retreats are very important. I'm reminded here that every time there's a new member that joins a team, the team is a new team. I think that's a very important concept for us to remember. And there's always an opportunity to reintroduce ourselves, to reorientate ourselves, and to come together as a group and really to go back through the norms of our group. But always remember that when one new member comes on the vestry, and annually we often see 1 or 2 or 3 members come on our vestry, to really take the opportunity to have a retreat or a vestry orientation and reorientate ourselves as a new team. Let's get that one. Any questions at this point, or any ideas? And if you could write those into the chat box. I'm having difficulty saying. Let's talk a little bit about really where I'd like to focus our attention tonight, is on the 3 essential ingredients for vital teams. Tonight I want to talk about what we think are essential for any team, vestry or boards or any team that comes together, is to focus on strong relationships, clear processes, and results. And I'll take these in turn. When we think about strong relationships, clear processes, and this whole notion of focusing on results, that's when any one of these areas come out of balance, the team is out of balance and the team loses its focus. So it's important to keep our relationships in balance, how we're working together and functioning and operating together as a team together, and having very clear guidelines around that, and also keeping our focus on the results. How are we trying to move the organization forward? First, strong relationships. Just a few questions to consider. Um, how do vestry members get to know one another? Recently, we did a retreat or a vestry workshop at a church, and the church was a very old parish, and they'd been around for some time. And after getting a ways through the presentation, one of the vestry members asked, "We have not had an opportunity to really to get to know each other." And that was quite surprising because it really should be one of the focus areas that we began our meetings with and began our conversation with. How do vestry members get to know each other? How are new vestry members orientated? Sometimes we assume that people have been around the church for a while and that they automatically know what the function of the vestry is or what the roles are, what the responsibilities. But always there's a good opportunity at the very beginning again to go through and get a good understanding and share what vestry members' responsibilities are. When teams come together, they typically come together and go through this process: form, storm, norm, and perform. Form is when a team gets to know each other, and we just spoke about that process of getting to know each other, maybe through icebreakers, maybe through sharing some personal experiences with the rest of the team. Storm is when we find teams, after they come together, in the very beginning, members on the team will struggle to find their identity or to find clarity around their identity. The best example I can give you of this is that when a new vestry is formed and different members of the vestry shift areas of responsibility. Maybe there's a new junior warden this year or a new senior warden. But members will struggle around trying to find their own identity around their role on a particular vestry. The third area is norm. And this is where we reach a point where roles have been identified. There have been some clarity around how the group will work together, what the responsibilities are, and some understanding around accountability. So we come from form to storm, and then we kind of norm out, and then we reach the place where we can begin to perform together effectively as a team. I think it's also important to say here is that teams will continually go through this process, particularly as new members come on, as new changes are made throughout the organization. We can continually go through this process between forming, norming, and storming and beginning to perform. But I think, again, it's up to the group and the leadership to find where we are in the process, to bring some stability to that so that we can move to the next phase, whether it's norm or ultimately to a level where we can perform at a high level. I talked a little bit about how some ideas for getting to know each other. We talked a little bit about maybe how do we start meetings with relationship building. Oftentimes when vestry meetings are held during midweek, for example, many of your members will be coming from work. Some will be coming from home after caring for a small child all day, and will come into the meeting with other thoughts or responsibilities on their mind. This is a good opportunity to allow and have space for those that may be coming from home or from work to settle into the meeting. So really a good opportunity around relationship building, but also to give people some space. What about communication styles? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a few moments. But the importance of knowing, learning, and sharing each other's communication styles can go a long way to strong relationships and building an effective team. We talked about a short check-in or Bible study at the beginning of vestry meetings. I had an interesting conversation this past week with a colleague, and they were talking to me about many of their vestry members do not come until after the Bible study is completed. It's important to understand that everything that we do in the church is grounded in scripture, grounded in study, so that before we begin our meetings, we should take some time to do Bible study and certainly prayer, and make sure that our vestry is grounded in these areas. I also talked a little bit about some useful icebreakers. You may think of some icebreakers that might work for you. Again, a way in which we provide time and provide space for members to get to know each other and to settle into the meeting, if you will. A little bit about communication styles. I always find when I have an opportunity to talk about communication styles that people are shocked. One, to understand and identify what their own particular communication style is, but also to have a sense of awareness for those that are around the table. So when we do some of this training, we ask people to try to identify what their communication style is. Are you a collaborator, a contributor, an analyzer, a promoter? How do you see yourself as passive aggressive or aggressive? One, to identify for themselves so that they understand how they're communicating and how they're being heard, but also an opportunity to recognize the differences in the room. And when we learn and understand each other's communication style, we can provide more space for others to have opportunities to speak, to share, and collaborate in a meeting setting. Questions or comments? Miguel, are you seeing any questions in the comment box, in the chat box? No.
So you're gonna have to forgive me. I'm in an airport at the moment, so there's a lot of background noise. There's just a question about some specific spiritual practices that could be used. I think sort of would stress that. One other thing I would mention is if people do have questions, please just raise your hand, even physically. We can kind of see you, I think, everyone except for Jennifer. And we can unmute you so you can speak directly to Ron.
Anything? Okay, well, I will carry on. Thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit about clear processes. And while building strong relationships is essential, and as we said, clear processes and focusing on results, clear processes is an area where we can all get our minds around what's required of us, what the responsibilities are, and how we're to be accountable to each other. And let's just get right into that. This is somewhere in which your vestry or your team may begin to talk about clear processes. Again, as I mentioned before, each time a new member joins a vestry, it's a new team, or a new member joins a team, it's a new team. So all of these things should be, again, discussed. How frequently are we going to meet? Where are we going to meet? What's the length of time? This is always an interesting conversation with my vestry here at St. Catherine's, is that each year when we bring together a new group, oftentimes we'll shift from a Wednesday night meeting to a Tuesday night meeting or a Thursday night meeting, or change the time depending upon the needs of those that are in the room. What about a conversation around what are the best and most life-giving parts of a vestry meeting? Where do people feel energized, inspired? And what are parts of a vestry meeting or a part of your meeting that needs a little work? Where do we need to focus? How do we improve? You know, oftentimes we come together as a group and we have meetings, but we don't take the time necessarily to reflect back and think about how are we functioning? How are things going? And what can we do better to make our meetings more efficient? So the three areas I'd like to just spend a few minutes to talk about tonight is running effective meetings, consensus decision-making, and facilitating conversations. From Backbreakers meeting by Ann Ditzler is we talk about the need to take time to prepare for meetings. You know, we spend a lot of time, and you will, and I can tell you as a rector, I certainly do, spend a lot of time in meetings. And meetings can be productive. But when we are in meetings, we want to make sure that we make the best use of our time, and be as productive as we can. So it would behoove us to spend some time before entering a meeting to plan and to prepare before starting a meeting. Meetings will be an essential part of your life in a parish community. Our responsibility or our goal is to make meetings as effective and efficient as possible so that we can see the fruits of our time together. Just some notes, some things that I'd like to share with you around how do we build a better agenda. If we want to have a more effective meeting and be more efficient in our meeting, perhaps the first place we should start is with the agenda. And how do we speak about our meeting? What is the purpose of our meeting? What is the purpose of a vestry meeting? And while I can't teach this whole curriculum in an hour, I will share with you vestry meetings are not for the purpose or are not committee meetings. Vestry meetings have a larger purpose of discussing and perhaps focusing on results and solving or working on problems and issues or moving the parish forward towards its vision and ministry and mission. But they are not committee meetings. And this is oftentimes why vestry meetings continue to be elongated, because they become, because the purpose of the meeting is not well defined. We talked a little bit about Bible study and sharing skill building at the beginning. Where should strategic items be discussed in a vestry agenda? What items require decision, which is really the reason why the group is coming together, is to make decisions around matters of parish life. And where should we put informational updates? When I speak of informational updates, I often am reminded about the number and plethora of reports that vestries receive, many of which should be read outside of the vestry meeting. So I would offer you 2 suggestions for helping improve your function as a team, and certainly as a vestry, is the consent agendas for typical business. What do I mean by this when I talk about a consent agenda for typical business? I'm speaking about reports from all of the various committee reports that may come to a vestry. I'm speaking about perhaps even the treasurer's report. I'm speaking about in terms of these areas that are what would be considered perfunctory for the vestry, and certainly information that would be considered history or historical for the vestry. Let me just explain a little bit how a consent agenda functions. All of the items that may fall into the categories I just mentioned, reports, items that are perfunctory for the agenda, including hearing of correspondence, the agenda itself, the previous meeting minutes perhaps, should be gathered together in one group. They should be sent out ahead of time to all members of the team, so that the team has an opportunity to review all of the items ahead of time. If without objection, all of the items that are sent ahead of time seem to be in order, they would then be added to the consent agenda and approved all at one time. So for example, you would approve the minutes from the previous meeting, the treasurer's report, all of your committee reports on one motion and one vote. This allows the team time to go forward and focus on really what matters, to really focus on the big decisions. Let me be clear here to say this, is that once items are put on the consent agenda, any member, before a vestry meeting begins, should have the ability to ask the chair or the clerk to have an item removed from the consent agenda for further discussion. Just a little word about treasurer's reports. When you're in parish life, you find that most of the month-to-month activity of a parish is not as important as perhaps the quarterly reports or the semi-annually or the annual reports. Many of our bills in the parish life come in once a quarter, and so you don't really see a full balance. We do believe it is very essential that all members receive a copy of the treasurer's report monthly and have a detailed discussion on the treasurer and budget reports on a quarterly basis at a minimum. So we're not suggesting that treasurer's reports never be looked at, but in the detail month over month, they could probably be added to the consent agenda. The second item I would share with you is, how do we work with unfinished business? Paris Life is very busy and there's always much to do, and there are many issues and opportunities and challenges that will come before you daily and monthly. One way to deal with that is to identify those opportunities and those challenges on your vestry agenda. Keeping in mind that you can't solve while we can't solve all the world problems in one day, we certainly can't solve all of our parish problems in 1 hour. But if we identify these items and put them before us, we can carry them month to month on our agenda. So they're always in front of us, we're always thinking about them, but we prioritize and take care of those matters that are most important inside the 90 minutes or 2 hour time frame that we have pre-established for our meeting. Just a little bit or a few words about decision making, if I might. This is new for many of you, I would believe, particularly if you participated on the vestry at some point in the past. We typically in vestry meetings really try to have what might be called a majority rule, where 51% of the group carries the vote. While there will be times when that will have to happen, we would advocate for and suggest that as best we can, we try to reach consensus around the group. By bringing everyone into the conversation, trying to create balance between what's needed and what's wanted by various members. Here on your screen, you'll just see some of the pros and cons around consensus decision making. Of course, everyone gets to participate. In terms of building strong teams and leading strong teams, in my experience after nearly 9 years of being a rector here at St. Catherine's, it is essential that we provide space and open the conversation up to all of those that are around the table. One, to keep people engaged, also because people bring many different gifts to the conversation, and we want to hear it all. And have that as a part of our calculus in our decision making, consensus decision making. It also requires, when we get to consensuses, rather than just reaching a 51% margin, we have to educate each other. We have to work with each other. We have to reach compromises, maybe even perhaps provide opportunities for greater understanding and sharing and learning. One of the greatest benefits is when we're all done with the conversation, it is our hope that through this whole process of consensus decision making that you leave the room with a decision that everyone can support. And of course, that's the rule of any team coming together. When we make a decision together and we make a decision, it's the decision of the team and can be fully supported outside the room by all of the team. The downside of consensus decision making, as it is with collaborative ministry, it requires time and discussion. And it requires us to be open, to listen, and that process takes time rather than cutting off the vote. And it also requires that the chair, which many of you will be as rector or priest in charge or clergy in charge, or even as lay in charge, we'll find that while it may take time, the time is well spent because everyone has buy-in to the process and the decisions that are being made. Any questions? Let's move on. The last area I want to talk about in terms of effective teams is focusing on results. And this is an important area because after all, that's the reason why we're there. That's the reason why we gather around that table. Yes, to build strong relationships, to have a good understanding of how we're going to function together and our accountability. But at the end of the day, we want to leave the room with results. As I say, that's why we get hired. That's why we get paid, is to make decisions and get results. So let's talk about focusing on results. Here's just a few questions that you might want to consider. as you prepare for your role as clergy, how does the parish identify its annual goals? Does the parish have annual goals? What are we focusing on? What's most important? And then once we understand what those goals are, or come around some ideals of perhaps of what our goals should be, how do we track our progress? How do we measure our accountability and our success and our achievement towards those goals? And this is a big one. And this is something we do very well on the team that I serve on with Miguel as Vital Teams, is how are we doing as a team? You know, I often say that, you know, results are very important, and that's the reason why we come together. But also process is important. How are we getting along as a team? How are we functioning as a team? How are we responding to our norms? So while we want to focus on our goals and our mission, we also want to make sure that when we talk about results, we're focusing on how we are working together as a team, and what opportunities are there to improve our work together. A little bit about goals. Two main areas I want to talk about is setting goals and this whole notion of feedback loop, both at the group level as well as the individual level. I'm sure some of you have heard about SMART goals. I went to Virginia, so I know that was my seminary at VTS, so I know they spoke about SMART goals to you. And if they haven't, it's coming soon, trust me. You'll hear a little bit about SMART goals and how to form those. But we talk about those in this way. Congregations, in conjunction with their mission and vision, should identify 2 to 3 SMART goals per year. That's it. Again, we can't solve all of the problems in 1 year, but we can solve, certainly, by the way, at this elephant as we go forward. 2 or 3 SMART goals. These goals should align themselves with our mission and vision of the congregation. You'll want to revisit your SMART goals each meeting. What are these goals? And then we'll talk about how they're addressed, but each meeting, this is a part of our time together. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about a simpler way in which to do some of your goal planning, and something I learned very early on in my career called management by objectives method. SMART goals. SMART is an acronym for identifying goals that are specific, measurable, again, assigned to, who is going to be accountable, who is going to carry it out. Are the goals realistic? You know, oftentimes you'll hear these conversations that we had all the money we could, what would we do? Well, most times we don't have all the money we need or want, so that's probably not a good starting place. So we'll want to think about, are our goals realistic? Realistic to our mission and ministry, realistic to our congregation size, realistic to our budget, realistic to what we're capable of to accomplish. And of course, time specific. Identifying the start time and the end time for each of our goals. When will we accomplish what we set out to do? This is an interesting acronym too that we often talk about, and it's less about goal setting and more about evaluating your goals. This acronym is MUSIC. Do our goals, or what we're focusing on, are they meeting the mission and vision that we set out to? How are they unique to our parish or our context and what we're working on? Are they sustainable? You know, there's a lot of good ideas out there, and things become hot buttons for a particular period of time, but is this particular goal sustainable? How do they reflect the identity of your particular parish, who you are, who you're called to be in your service? And this whole notion of capacity goes back to that question which I talked about a little bit earlier when we were talking about congregational size. You know, the rule applies in congregations as it does in most places. 20% of the people Do 80% of the work. I have this saying that I use, and I learned it from somewhere many years ago, and you've probably heard it too, that there's 3 types of people. Those that watch things happen, those that wonder what happens, and those that make things happen. So that's an important question always to consider with your capacity. Do we have the people resources? Do we have the physical resources? Do we have the financial resources to accomplish a particular goal? And this is a good way to continue to monitor your goals as you go through that process. This is perhaps the method I use more commonly than not. I now call it ministry by objective. It comes from a traditional method called management by objective. Some of you who may, or management by results. Some of you from other disciplines may have heard of this use before. But ministry by objectives, I'm calling it management by objectives, is simply identifying what your goal is and then delineating all of the tasks necessary to accomplish that goal. So we have a top level goal, and we want to start a new Sunday school program. What are all of the tasks necessary or objectives necessary to accomplish that goal? And that's a simple process, and then we simply go through and identify what those are, what those tasks or objectives are, assign a date, a completion time to them, and an individual or team that will complete that work. This is a simpler process than the SMART goals, but keep in mind it does not always address all of the elements that we just previously spoke about in terms of SMART goals. Again, prioritize objective. All of these objectives must be measurable in some way. There's a question again about being realistic. And when we're talking about realistic, again, keep in mind the notion of capacity. Are they consistent with our policies and our mission? And are they compatible with other goals? This is very important. Oftentimes in congregational life, we can find ourselves on several train tracks at one time. And how do we bring those together? How do we understand these goals as being compatible with the various opportunities and challenges we have in the parish? So compatibility is an important question. And just a second. Speaking of discussing goals at regular meetings, how do we do that? Again, I suggest that we carry these meeting to meeting. I think there's an opportunity for us to discuss our norms. We're going through that right now with our team, our vital teams. We just had a new member start our team maybe about 6 weeks ago or so. And so we're reviewing the norms together, not just for the new member of our team, but so that all of us can share how are we doing with that. One of the things I suggest is that when you work with your team and you develop a list of norms, have those norms prominently displayed in your meeting space. This can easily be accomplished by having them typed out or printed, going down to FedEx or Kinko's and having those printed on a laminated board and placed prominently in your meeting room. This does 2 things, I think. I think it draws our attention, the vestry's attention, to what our norms are, what we said we were going to do, how we were going to hold ourselves accountable, how we were going to work together. But I bet there's a lot of other groups in the parish and teams that will use that space that your vestry use. And it will give them an opportunity to reflect on their norms and as a group together. When we've identified a couple, 3 goals, when one drops off, it's time to again go into the discernment process and discern what's next. Remember earlier, I talked to you about a list of putting everything on your agenda that needs to be done, but only addressing your top priorities. So a good management of your time and a good management of your team will be always to have what's next. We've completed goals 1, 2, and 3. What's next? What's the next goal? And because we've had it identified for some time, in many cases, there's already been some thinking or some strategy around that. So we can move quickly into the next goal. So that we're already always carrying 2 to 3 goals at one time. But what's important is that those 2 or 3 goals that we're focusing on, that we take the time to make sure that there's space in every meeting to do that. And I hope that with the use of a consent agenda, it allows you time to do that. We talk about establishing regular and informal feedback. Again, I can't say how important this is. How are we doing at a group level? What's working for us? And again, a part of that conversation could be around norms, but what's working well together? There's interesting things that will come up. Perhaps you did establish a meeting time for 6:30 in the evening or 7 o'clock in the evening. And I just recently went through this with one of the boards I am a chair at. Is we learned that one of the members had a change in their work schedule so they could come earlier. And so while we were holding the meeting to meet at 6:30 in the evening, we learned that where the group position was, we could meet a little bit earlier because one of the team members had a change in their schedule. So that came up. But we're, again, constantly talking about how can we work better together as a group. And this has more to do with us individually and as a team versus the business of the vestry or the business of the group. This is something my boss does very well, one-on-ones. We have one-on-one meetings about every 6 weeks where Miguel calls each member of his team up, and I believe he's somewhere now around 7 members of the team. We have a pretty expansive team. Where Miguel sets up a time to meet with each member of our team. And this is not an opportunity, again, to talk about business necessarily, but how are we doing individually? A check-in. An opportunity for people to tell you what's going on in their lives, because we know often what's going on in our personal lives affect our work life in some way. There's times when we're up and we want to share what's good and what's wonderful about what's going on. And there's time where you may want your immediate supervisor to know, things aren't going real well right now, or there are some opportunities. But it's certainly a time that I think all of our team cherish with our supervisor, Miguel, because it's not about business, it's about the individual. And when you talk about building strong relationships, it starts there. That's at the heart of it. It's trying to understand who we are as individuals, what we bring to the conversation and to the table, much beyond just our own business skill sets, our own ministry skill sets, our own theological conversation. And it's also a time for Miguel to share with his team how things are going in his life and how are things going. So I think there's 2 aspects there. At the group level, how are we doing? And at the individual level. And that can be done on a number of ways. But I think it's absolutely essential that as leaders, we take time to find out how our people are doing, what's going well for them. And so I find that to be very helpful, and I really encourage that. One, for you as a leader, but also for building a great relationship with your team members. Here's some of the questions that we would suggest that you use for either individual or group feedback. Again, how are we doing as a team? How are we responding to our norms? Should we add some additional norms? Are there things that maybe no longer apply, but just an opportunity to discuss around that? I will also say, when you have an opportunity to talk about your norms, it's a way in which you could build greater cohesiveness amongst your team and also bring to the attention of other members what's important. It's not necessary to tell Jay Smith, Jay, you're always late at a meeting. We're always waiting to get started because you're not here on time. If we have a conversation about the norms, And Jay Smith realizes, oh, one of our neat norms is we've committed to each other to being here on time. Maybe that's enough a reminder to Mr. Smith. This question about what's going well and what's not, what hasn't. We just did a conference last week, and let me give you 2 words that may help with this. That's a little bit softer. What should we do again, or what should we do over, or what should we change? Right? Yeah, that's a little softer. So, what's good? What is a do-over? And what needs more attention? I think those are 2 important questions to always ask ourselves as a team and in the work we're doing. And then, of course, this question of what makes things go better. How would you change our work together? How would you reorchestrate this? So here's one of the things that I would offer to you, maybe to try at the next gathering that you have. Perhaps this might even be at one of the groups that you work with there at VTS, an interactive exercise. Think about a goal, or think about something that you're working on, and how does it fit the SMART model? Specific, measurable, assigned, realistic, and time-specific. I know that in my time at VTS, there was a number of opportunities to do group work together. And this may be something that you might find helpful even in your time right now at VTS. Here's another interactive exercise that we would kind of introduce to you. This goes more to the model that I showed you earlier, the music model. How does a goal that we establish meet this criterion? On a scale of 1 to 10, how is it connected to our mission and vision? On a scale of 1 to 10, how does it increase our financial sustainability? On a scale of 1 to 10, do we have the internal capacity to do this? So this is just, again, a tool that you might use to measure how your goal, what your goal is, and how you're performing to that goal. The last area we talk about, and I hope you'll take this with you, is just identifying some next steps. Often when we have an opportunity to do this training with congregations and vestries and dioceses across the country, we ask at the end of our time is to identify maybe a couple areas that you might find effective. As you all begin to discern, and maybe some of you are now working in parishes, in your field ed parishes, you may want to look for some of these things that we talked about tonight in terms of building strong relationships, clear processes, and focusing on results. And then maybe think in those settings that you're in, those congregations that you're working on, what are some areas that might be effective for them to work on? Where you're signing your field ed parish, could there be some work done with building relationships? Maybe around retreats, or even conversations around good communication styles, clear processes. And I offer this to you because I also at some point you will probably have an opportunity to do a particular program or project in your parish. This may be an opportunity or an area where you may be able to pierce inside to what's going into the congregation or into the work of the parish and the leadership, and may be able to do some research and maybe offer some assistance in these 3 areas. Strong relationships, clear process, these are focusing on results. I think I did not include my additional resource page this evening, but I would share with you, the Episcopal Church Foundation has a host of additional resources that will help you in your work and in your journey as clergy and leaders in the church. So please feel free to contact us at our website, www.episcopalchurchfoundation.org, or you can call us in New York, and we can direct you to the many resources that we have. But one thing I would really suggest to all of you who are planning for parish life, to get you a copy of the Episcopal Church Foundation Vestry Resource Guide. It is an invaluable resource for those who are planning to lead vestries and to move into that role, into the parish life, and really understanding how vestries come together and work together and can function cohesively together. That is my spiel for tonight. I want to thank you all for your attention, and I want to thank Allison for having us again. For having us again. As I said, this is the wonderful seminary that I graduated from, and I'm so proud to be a part of the BTS family and an opportunity to come back and share with you all. So thank you so much, Allison. Blessings to you. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to address those. We have about 5 minutes left. And if you raise your hand, Miguel would be happy to turn on your microphone. And I'd be happy to address any of your questions.
You can also, if you have any questions, you can also type them into the chat box. Oh, great.
Thank you very much for your time and for this presentation. A couple of questions came up for me that I needed some time to put into words earlier in the presentation. This is Nick Roosevelt. I'm in Scottsdale. It's only 5 for me, so good night, everyone, but we've still got sunlight. The question is around the process of using kind of what you called or described as a results-oriented, I don't know, the task. You gave the example of starting a Sunday school. And what I'm wondering is how much in that process is there kind of the entering of, well, what is the history of the Sunday school that stopped running? Why did it stop running? What are the systemic implications for those things? I had an experience with trying to enhance coffee hour after the 10:15 service, only to realize that we functionally serve coffee in 6 different places on a Sunday, to the choir over here, and that there are as many people involved in serving the same food to those different groups. And it was, while I said identify stakeholders to our team, I didn't realize how complex that was going to get. So I'm wondering, with that kind of process, where do we ask those questions and identify the systemic issues and the stakeholders?
Right. Certainly, that's a great question, Nate. Thank you for that. That process begins before we really get into establishing the framework for the goals. Back in the discernment process, we're really understanding the need for a particular goal and what that goal is. Much of what we were speaking about here in the presentation with ministry by objectives, I believe was the motto I was using, was when you already have identified what the goal is. For example, something we dealt with here in my congregation not too long ago was I sit on 11.5 acres of land, and we have a number of trees. We understood for maybe long time that we needed to do something about shoring up our trees because they're old trees. So we knew that's what the goal was to take care of the trees. Then we had to find what the tasks were. So when we speak about SMART goals and ministry by objective goals and that planning process of how to accomplish the goals, much of the discernment should take place before you get to that point, and during the necessary research. But certainly, as a part of the process, there may be additional research that needs to be done. Maybe there are conversations that need to take place in that.
Right.
So there's really 2 phases, the early discernment, and then as we go through the process, maybe there is additional work that we need, or additional information that we need, or studies that we need.
Right. Second question, I was, as you mentioned, a member of a vestry as a baptized member of my congregation before ordination, and it was a small congregation, and the vestry functioned very differently than the current vestry at my resource-sized parish, where I'm an associate and don't attend all of the vestry meetings. we had a slide on it, but I wonder, some of the things I was thinking about, Miguel, in the one-on-ones is, if I imagine myself as rector and I've got a staff of 10 people, and then I've got a vestry member of 12 people, and then I've got ministry leaders who are in an area of 6 people, I'm doing nothing but one-on-ones, and that doesn't even allow for the perhaps larger constituency. So I wonder if you could talk about kind of the discernment of where to focus that time on asking questions or building those relationships, when a vestry of a large parish is not necessarily in the weeds like a vestry of a smaller parish.
I think that, again, it has to do with the leadership itself. For example, I have 3 teams that I run, that I'm involved in here in my parish. The only team that I actually run or chair is my vestry. My oversight team, which does all of my parish planning and projects and programs, that's chaired by a layperson, right? So that's their team.
Right.
So they have a responsibility there. And of course, we do some sharing there. The other team I have is an adult day center that I run, that I'm the CEO and president of. That's a different setup. So I think when I'm speaking about that, is that I'm speaking about the team leader of a particular team. So we certainly need to spread that out amongst those team leaders. And for a resource parish such as where you are right now, Nick, I would imagine that you all have several teams with different leaders on those teams. If not, then I need to come see you guys right away. Because if the rector should have a few reports to them, right? As you as an associate should have a few reports to them, and there's some understanding of about what span of control is, right? One person cannot manage 30 people or et cetera. So
Right.
Part of that is making sure that we understand how our organization is set up and how teams are broke up. Now, that does not mean that there's not some sharing, right, among those. My oversight team leader, who's a lay person, certainly shares with me and speaks about how her team members are doing or how that team is functioning. But those are not individual meetings that I would establish for myself, unless there was a reason for me to get more involved in those conversations. So always, I think, first of all, start with span of control. What does span of control look like? And then let those team leaders do their work in terms of check-ins.
Thank you.
Well, I think that is our time, and I want to honor your time. I want to thank you, Nick, and Allison, and the others that are out there that have participated with us tonight. Again, please feel free to contact us by our website or in New York, and we can be of any help for you. Again, our goal is to strengthen congregations out there and provide resources to help you do your ministry and work. So with that, I'm just going to bid you all a good night, and we'll see you then. We'll see you when we're on the Holy Hill.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. Have a good night, all. Thanks, Kirsten.